And so low-tech, LO-TEK, are these technologies referencing traditional ecological knowledge systems into the field of sustainability and climate resilient design.
Welcome back to the AskNature Podcast. Today, we're diving deep into a concept that completely flips the script on how we view technology and design in the face of widespread ecosystem changes and loss of biodiversity.
Exactly, Andrew. In this episode, I am in conversation with the landscape architect, author, and teacher, Julia Watson, who released the book LO-TEK in 2019 and then LO-TEK Water in 2025. Through her writing, teaching, and landscape architecture, she amplifies the ancestral knowledge and traditional ecological solutions from around the world that work better than the industrial ones that we more readily turn to. I'm really excited to chat with you and talk more about your work with LO-TEK and more. So I thought we could start. I know that you came up with the term LO-TEK. I'd love it if you could explain it a little bit more, its origins.
So low-tech, LO-TEK, which was the title of the book and really sort of the philosophy that's very well known now, is to try and create a space of acknowledgement about what these technologies are, that they are really referencing traditional ecological knowledge systems and bring that type of knowledge into the field of sustainability and climate resilient design. It was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek play on words, and I wanted to include the term TEK in the phrasing of what these technologies were. And so TEK itself is a term which is traditional ecological knowledge, and the definition of that is a cumulative body of multi-generational knowledge, practices, and beliefs. TEK is a term, one interpretation of that body of knowledge that can be called IK, indigenous knowledge. There's IRED, indigenous regenerative ecological design. And so low-tech is also just one interpretation of what these are. And there's multiple ways that different people sort of have a nomenclature for what these systems can be.
Yeah, amazing. I so much appreciated you bringing that term into play. I know that you've mentioned that the low-tech solutions focused on water. You've talked about them as sort of ancestral infrastructures, that they're living relational kind of understandings of time and place and coevolutionary. And despite the colonial narrative that they're obsolete, there are so many examples of low-tech that are thriving and have been evolving for thousands of years. I'd love it if you could share some of those incredible examples for us.
One of those is the Medan floating islands that are found in the southern wetlands of Iraq. And this is a 6,500-year-old system as far as we know. It is a system of floating islands of a community that was once 500,000 people before Saddam Hussein drained the southern wetlands of Iraq. That turned that entire wetland system, which was one of the largest wetland systems in the Middle East, into a desert. That system has now been regenerated somewhat since that draining, and a lot of the community who were displaced have returned. But this community have lived there continuously for 6,500 years, and they create these islands out of a singular species of reed called the Kasabri. And these islands float for about 25 years, but on top of these islands, they also create houses made of that very same reed. The houses are incredibly unique, and that single species of reed is used to form really big sort of cylindrical columns that are counterweighted to form the overall structure. Then they create rafters out of that reed, bundling that reed together. Then they weave that reed into walls and floors and roof systems. And then they spin that reed into a twine to actually bind the entire building together. Not to mention that they grind it into flour or make bread. They feed this reed to their buffalo. They create boats. It's really this incredible versatility of a single material technology from, the actual fundamental material logic all the way up to the structural system. I think that's beautiful design in itself. But I think what's really intelligent is that they then, to create the performance of buoyancy, which they need to create these floating islands that can be responsive to the flooding or the reduction of floodwater in this environment, the species of reed rots. And so a performance that within construction is really destructive. And you don't want any of your buildings or your boats or anything that you construct when you're in the built environment, you don't really want it to rot. That's like the enemy of an architect or the enemy of a designer. But for this particular condition, because they want to create buoyancy, they create a condition to exacerbate decomposition within the island material tissue so that buoyancy is created. And I just think there's such incredible logics that are being composed by this community about their material geography.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. Especially, I'm thinking as you're talking about two things. Firstly, the idiocy of the current system where we assume that an industrial approach is going to be somehow, superior or more efficient or such. And I'm also kind of hearing the biomimicry threads through. Of course, I would. Given that's our focus here at the Institute, I'm hearing around this real intricate understanding of ecology of place. I'd love to play a little bit with the sort of learning from nature's genius focus that we have at the Institute and your work in LO-TEK and how you see those two things coming together or not.
So I think every single one of these systems has that, and I talk about this idea of symbiosis as inherently built into these types of knowledge systems. But in accompaniment to that, I was really interested in exploring, how is contemporary technology, contemporary material technology, landscape architectural methodologies or architecture, how is that interacting or intersecting with ancestral knowledge systems to essentially birth new forms of technologies that we've never seen before. And I think what's really interesting is to see how traditional ecological knowledge can then inform design.
How do you see that sort of braiding of those two things coming together, moving forward in the way that you've so beautifully articulated in your work and in your book?
I think what's apparent is that it's not a postulation, it's already happening, and it may not be happening in within standardized building materials to code that we can build with in New York City or some of the cities that we live in. But it's not that, how could this happen? It's how is it happening? And it's happening in lots of different ways around the globe whereby people are looking at these systems and working with communities, which is, to answer the first part of the question, one of the ways that this has to happen is through co-design. But I think the co-design is really incredibly essential. So the knowledge is collaboratively owned. And so in intellectual property, usually there's something called a memorandum of understanding that's used to protect intellectual property, or patents are used to protect technologies. And that really asymmetrically aligns with Western legal systems. And so when you're working with a community that has oral traditions and collaborative ownership of knowledge, one thing that I've been working on for a couple of years is how to find a middle ground so that we're not always working with asymmetrically aligned legal technologies that are really bias Western legal systems when you're working with Indigenous intellectual property. And in a project that I did 2-3 years ago, we created something called an SOU, a Smart Oath of Understanding, which was an oral-based contract that was written in really aspirational language. And it was a smart contract, so it was a digital contract. And so if, we haven't been able to move this forward yet to actually make it an actual legal technical innovation that can be actually used and triggered, but it uses smart contracting, which is contracting that can be publicly encoded into blockchain. And so it's incredibly transparent. You don't need big legal teams to actually sort of execute any of the transfer of value or compensation that is determined by community in the engagement of this SOU. And so with my work, we've really tried to push these boundaries of like, how do you create middle grounds that bridge Indigenous knowledge systems and non-Indigenous knowledge systems? Because I think it's very presumptuous to always ask people who have knowledge systems outside Western knowledge systems to always have to interact with one single Western knowledge system. And so the idea was to create some sort of a middle ground that really worked with oral, because you speak this contract and it's recorded. So it really works with oral-based transfers of knowledge as well.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing those processes with us. I'd love to hear just a little more about what are you up to since the books, with the books, what's next on the horizon for you?
Yeah, in 2024, we launched the LO-TEK Institute, and we have now 2 curriculums. And the curriculums were initially for, as I said, for high school, because LO-TEK was actually being taught for the AP, Advanced Placement AP program at American high schools around the globe. And so, which was really interesting. I sort of found this out randomly by looking at my TED Talk and seeing all these students who are writing, "Who's here for AP?" Woohoo! And which was really fun. So it was already being taught within high schools as this bridging for advanced placement to college. And so we created Living Earth, which is based on the first book. It's over 90% sourced from Indigenous primary sources. It is a curriculum for teachers. So we actually teach teachers. What's really interesting is like high schools use this, 165 high schools in Canada use this as part of the way they taught their students. And we are working with the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung Aboriginal Corporation in Melbourne, outside Melbourne in Victoria. So, the curriculum has just had these like pathways that we just didn't expect, which is so fascinating because I'll just say that like in second year architecture in Australia and University of Queensland, I was taught Aboriginal environments. That was a seminar that all of us had to take. And that changed the trajectory of my entire career. So now I feel like come full circle. There's kind of a reciprocity of being able to give this opportunity to other students, especially here in the United States, but globally, which is great. I just also launched an office in February, but it's kind of been soft behind the scenes for about 9 months. But it's Indigenous and non-Indigenous, all women, it's 4 of us, designers and scientists. So we have 2 landscape architects, an Indigenous resilient ecological designer, and a green chemist working on our team. And that's because these systems and these technologies are design and science, and ironically, only very recently recognized by both design and science formally. So really the model of the office was to obviously co-lead with Indigenous and non-Indigenous within the leadership. We also have anywhere between 16 to 20 person advisory circle that we meet 2 to 4 times a year, and sometimes infrequently, informally, of majority Indigenous designers, architects, educators from around the globe, who are really there and established to ethically guide protocols, practice and projects, I guess, since 1996 when I took that course in Australia, really trying to understand, what this journey is and how there can be a platform plus sort of a new design model and a sort of educational model for this philosophy of low-tech.
Amazing work, Julia.
Well, thank you very much for saying that.
Yeah,
good to hear sometimes. Thanks so much, Amanda.
Thank you for joining us.
That was a great conversation, Amanda. So often we act and think as though everything about the challenges we face is new, and that any solution to them will be new as well. But it's more like they're just new to you. Julia's work shines a light on the ingenuity and experience and breadth of solutions that Indigenous cultures have developed and practiced in very specific local environments throughout time. It's thrilling to see how that knowledge is now being implemented in infrastructure projects around the world.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. What is powerful for me is that the outcomes for people, communities, ecologies, and the more than human world are better, and the solutions are more resilient and simple to implement. Again, if we listen and learn from communities where people and nature have not lost their connection, we can find tried and tested solutions right in front of us. I know that next week we have another incredible conversation coming up, this time with you and Baratundi Thurston, that builds on the reconnection with nature that our conversations have been focused on so far and expands it into new realms of technology and community. So tune in next week to hear more. The AskNature Podcast is a project of the Biomimicry Institute. The podcast is hosted by me, Amanda Sturgeon, the Institute's CEO.
And by me, Andrew Howley, the Institute's chief editor. Our sound crew includes Lucas Murray and Simon Thomas George, who composed the music and sound design and mixed this episode. Audio production and story editing by Ayawade Balagoon and Camilo Garzon. Executive production by Amanda, Camilo, and me. For more resources on biomimicry and regenerative design, visit us at asknature.org. To connect with fellow listeners and other professionals in biomimicry and regenerative innovation, join our online community at asknature.org/hive and enter podcast to receive 30% off your subscription. What will you ask nature next?